Hi everyone, I just wanted to make sure that I'm sharing this video with you. It's our crash course in culture. It's an introduction to Unit 4, which will begin in Instructional Cycle 3 for this class from Mrs. Wall's World Geography. I wanted to share with you a little bit about culture and also share with you the fact that a lot of the information that you're going to see on the IA about culture is also going to be found within this video and PowerPoint. So please make sure that you make some notes about some of the things that we're going to go over within this PowerPoint in order to help you on your IA for Instructional Cycle 2. There are many things that influence culture, a few of which we'll talk about within this PowerPoint. They are ethnicity, movement, colonization, language, values, religion, conflicts, and socioeconomics. Ethnicity is one of the things that affects culture in a society. Ethnicity is when you have a group of people bound together by common national, linguistic or language, cultural or religious origins. There is a difference between ethnicity and race. Race typically deals with skin color, while ethnicity deals with characteristics that bind people together. So one of the factors that makes people who they are is their ethnicity, and that's their shared ancestry. So shared ancestry is the thing that makes up ethnicity. You can actually have people that are two different races that have the same ethnicity. So people who come from the same place often have common values and belief systems. They observe the same traditions, practice the same religion, and speak the same language. I'd like you to take a few seconds and think about what your ethnicities are. If you've done some DNA testing through something like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, you probably have a pretty good idea, but it might not mean that you identify with that culture. Some of your ethnicities are going to be your heritage that's passed down from your parents and their parents and so on. So just take a few seconds and think about what some of your ethnicities are. An important example for ethnicity has to do with the Slavic population in Eastern Europe over 1,000 years ago. The largest ethnic group in Eastern Europe are descendants of the Slavs who first came to the region nearly 2,000 years ago. The Slavic people first settled in the area we now call Poland, Slovenia, and Ukraine. By the end of the 700s, their population had spread in all directions. It spread north to the Baltic Sea, south into Greece, east into Russia, and west into the Alps. Because they came to the area so long ago and spread out over so vast a region, their religious practices and languages have since grown apart. So if you have ancestry in Eastern Europe, more than likely you have ancestry that can be related back to the Slavs. So we started off with the Slavic people, and then as they started to move, the culture started to shift based on the physical geography and human geography of the places in which they migrated to. So when people move or migrate, the culture is affected. Like we saw in the previous slide, when the Slavic people started to move throughout Europe, their culture started to change. In the past, people moved between places on foot, by animal, or by sailboat. This made transportation and the movement of different ideas and peoples very slow. Nowadays, we also have advanced transportation of cars, trains, planes, and boats. So movement occurs at a faster rate, but we also have the internet. Okay, with the click of a button on our computer, we can learn about events that are taking place on the other side of the world. And so movement of ideas is happening faster and faster because of technology. You might say that when people move, so does their culture and their ideas. The culture they bring to their new location begins to change a bit due to things like cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is when you adopt some of the culture of your new location, and then you also add to the culture of your new location. Take, for example, somebody that is from America who's living in France. On Thanksgiving, the American household is probably going to celebrate Thanksgiving. But in France, that's not a French holiday. And so if they invite their French neighbors to their Thanksgiving dinner, they're culturally diffusing the idea of Thanksgiving to their French neighbors. So the spread of ideas or innovations from one person to another is known as diffusion. If you've ever eaten with chopsticks, had a taco, eaten sushi, you've experienced cultural diffusion when the cultural aspects of one culture moves to another over time. So now we're going to talk about the aspect of colonization. We've already determined that when people move, so does their culture, and this is especially true with colonization. Colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. Indigenous peoples are the people that were there first. With colonization comes clashes in cultural values, conflict, and ultimately lots of major changes in the culture of the people, both the settlers and the indigenous people. The colonization of Australia is a good example of how indigenous peoples and colonizers have interacted with each other over time. In Australia, the first people or indigenous people were called the Aborigines. When Great Britain started to turn Australia into a penal colony, where they basically sent convicts or criminals to Australia to pay their sentence or to work off their time, their sentence, many Aborigines were killed from disease and a lot of conflict resulted. The Aborigines were actually enslaved also by the Australian people. And so you have a lot of cultural diffusion, but it's not necessarily something light like eating tacos or chopsticks. You're talking about cultures clashing, and out of conflict, cultural diffusion happened as well. Those cultural shifts, that cultural diffusion that takes place with colonization, often depends on who is colonizing. For example, Latin American culture has been mostly influenced by the Spanish and Portuguese because it was Spain and Portugal that colonized much of Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. Oftentimes, colonizations have a lot in common. If we take, for example, Latin America and Australia, the inside of this Venn diagram shows the similarities that the two colonies or colonizers had. So in both Latin America and Australia, many natives were killed by European diseases such as smallpox. The colonists didn't respect the culture or way of life of the natives, and resistance and conflict occurred between the natives and the colonists. Oftentimes, natives were enslaved. So those are some of the similarities. Some of the differences, in Latin America, there was African slave labor because they were a part of the triangular trade. And so in the Caribbean, Africans were bought and sold from Africa. In Latin America, there was also something called the Columbian Exchange, talking about that diffusion. The Columbian Exchange is named after Christopher Columbus, and it's the idea that there was an exchange of plants, diseases, and animals between the Americas and Europe. And then also the main settlers, like we talked about before, were the Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America. When we think about Australia, it's a little bit of a different situation because, again, in Australia, they were creating a penal colony. And so the white prisoners and criminals that were brought over from Great Britain were enslaved in Australia along with the Aborigines. The main settlers in Australia were British and Danish, and there were three different groups of people. There were the colonists that were in power, the white criminals who had been brought over to serve time, and then also the Aborigines or the natives. So language is something that's very much affected by colonization, and I want to talk about that within this slide. Language is something that changes when cultures change. So from the previous slide, you can see that the areas that were colonized by Spain were also Spanish-speaking countries, and the colonies that were created by Portugal were Portuguese-speaking countries, okay? Spanish and Portuguese are considered part of the Romance languages. Now, if we look at this map here in the red, we're going to see where the Romance languages are. It's Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, and Romania are the Romance languages. They have their roots in Latin. So the Romance languages are those of Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, and Romania, and they have their roots in Latin. Those are the Romance languages. The other main group of language that came out of colonization was the Germanic languages. Now, the Germanic languages are those of Sweden, Norway, Great Britain. So English is a Germanic language. And in our country, in America, we speak English because we were mostly culturally influenced by the British colonizers. So the colonization of the Americas and the fact that there was this era of exploration in this western part of Europe really does play a role in how languages spread around the world. So Germanic and Romance languages are the two main language groups of Europe that were tied to colonization. In the green here, you have Slavic language. Now, Slavs were the main ethnic group in Eastern Europe, but because they didn't colonize much, they aren't Slavic languages are not necessarily languages that have spread around the world, because this was an area that did not do colonization in the same ways that the Germanic and the Romance languages colonized. So to sum this slide up, there's a lot of information here. The Romance languages and Germanic languages are the two largest language groups in Europe that were tied to colonization. The third largest language group in Europe is the Slavic language groups, and that is not as widespread among the countries of the world because this area did not do as much in the way of colonization of the world.